I've been trying to write about him as a filmmaker who started working in the 1960s till post-emergency. And what excited me about Sukhdev was the fact that here's this filmmaker who begins work as a filmmaker who critiqued the state in the mid-60s, and in the mid-70s he becomes a filmmaker that is pro-emergency and makes films which supports the emergency program. So Sukhdev, for me, is a very, very interesting filmmaker from somebody who emerges as a filmmaker who is critiquing the state to somebody who gets subverted or who's co-opted by the state. So the story that I'm going to talk to you today is not about, so this is an incomplete paper in the sense that what I've been working is, I've just worked on these two films. And then after this, he makes a stunning film. Probably one of his crowning glory is a film called On the Bangladesh Liberation War, a stunning work. And it's during the making of that film and a little earlier that he becomes close to Indira Gandhi, and then during emergency, he's offered by Indira Gujral, who is the IB minister, to make 20 films on the 20-point program. It might seem, and I've seen some of his films, he did not make all the films on the 20 point, but a couple of films he made, and one of them that I don't remember the name, which was one of the most, I think, one of the earliest film on bonded labor, critiquing the bonded labor in Bihar. So I think he's just an extraordinary filmmaker who is politically committed to using documentary as a mean of politically articulating the incongruities of India. So I'm going to read most of my stuff. In between, I'll pause and speak. So it was in April of 1948 that the Indian post-colonial state realized the importance of statist documentaries when it regrouped the various abandoned film units of the World War II propaganda machinery and formed the Films Division. This institutional formation, housed in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, was arguably the largest single statist producer and distributor of non-fiction cinematic representation in the world. For the next 48 years, till 1996, it released close to 8,000 titles. These documentaries and newsreels made by Films Division was compulsorily shown in 12,000 cinema theaters in the country. It produced close to 160 films on an average per year and released nearly 700 prints of each of them. This massive output of films made it the largest statist filmmaking organization of the 20th century. Although the break with history was what was the nature of these films? I'm just going to talk a little bit about what majority of Films Division films are all about. And this is a term that I call it bureaucratic realism. It's a cinematic convention of realist, non-narrative films that depicted the actuality of post-colony within the hegemonic framework of the nation-state. A form of statist documentary that epitomized the realistic standard of war propaganda, but had pedagogical intentions that attempted to reveal the exemplary vision of the post-colonial nation in didactic tracts. Unlike the earlier colonial films, these were national narratives that reconfigured the colony into a nation, swiftly seizing the teleology of modernity within the formidable grasp of the post-colonial nation-state. The task at hand was to redefine the relationship of the state with its people from an early subject owing allegiance to the imperial crown to the formation of citizen subject of a democratic post-colonial polity. Bureaucratic realism celebrated Nehruvian fixation with the monumentality of big dams and industrialization as fetishized figurations of modernity that was driven by a developmentist imagery of the nation. Its logic was based on a patronizing rationality of the bureaucratic imagination that sought to produce patriotic citizens in task of nation building. This form of realistic representation located the post-colonial subjectivity of its citizen within the bureaucratic agency of the state. The didactic narratives of films not only informed them of the generative possibility of chemical fertilizers, but also dictated the intimate sexual life of its citizenry, counseling them on appropriate contraceptive technology. Within this larger bureaucracy, so this is the kind of film that you could, I mean, almost say is what a film division essentially produced. I would say close to about 90% of the 8,000 films are films like these, which are really kind of trying to reconfigure the relationship between the individual citizen and the state. But within this, in the late 60s, and when Gene Vahanagri became the Director General of the Chief Producer of the Films Division, that a new bunch of filmmakers came in. They have been incorrectly, I think, categorized as avant-garde filmmakers by V.D. Karga. But for me, these are the first political documentary filmmakers in India that challenged this form of films division's bureaucratic cinematic narrative of a robust nation marching into the modern world. These were young independent filmmakers who strategically maneuvered the institutional organization of films division and produced films critical of the state under its banner. Between 1965 and 1970, a spate of films were produced by a small bunch of filmmakers who worked in the bureaucratic confines of films division but subverted its ideological framework and created a body of work that broke away from the realist bureaucratic representation of films division. S. Sukhdev, Pramod Pati, S.N.S. Shastri, K.S. Chari, P.A. Abraham radically altered documentary film scene in India. Films like Face to Face, 1967, I'm 20, 1968, Report on a Drought, 1968, India 67, which is also called an Indian Day, 1967, Explorer in 1968, seriously disturbed the ossified representation of bureaucratic documentaries and announced to the nation that behind the veneer of big dams, monumental factories, agricultural revolution, and seemingly democratic polity was an unjust society, an uneven country, where revolting poverty, scathing hunger, horrible drought existed and throttled the majority of nation's population. At the forefront of this movement of critical documentary filmmaking practice was the enfant terrible, as he was called, S.O.T., the enfant terrible of Indian documentary films, the angry man of Indian documentary world, S.O.T. He began his career working with the German documentary filmmaker Paul Zils, who reached Indian subcontinent at the end of World War II as a prisoner of war from the Eastern War theater. He was German. Paul Zils later on in the 50s came into prominence while making films for corporate houses like Burma Shell. Under him, in turn, a number of filmmakers who eventually made documentaries for Films Division. Sukhdev was one of them, and he came into prominence in 1958 with a film which was produced by Khadi Village and Industry Commission on Vinoba Bhave's Buddhan movement, a film called The Saint and the Peasant. Inspired by the Gandhian intervention in the inequalities prevalent in modern India, Sukhdev's film is a gentle and a compassionate critique of the nation deeply beleaguered by the iniquities of feudal society in which millions of people were landless and exploited. However, in the ensuing years, Sukhdev became politically radicalized, especially while on assignments documenting the anti-price rise movement that the Communist Party of India spearheaded in the 1960s. And the sequences in the first film that you see are from those days. Although his engagement with the communists was professional, but the Marxist class critique that the CBI was leveling, the CBI and the trade union movement in Bombay, they were very closely part of the mill area out there, that the CBI was leveling against the new post-colonial nation since 1940s deeply impacted his subsequent film production.